You completely go 100% without carbs and our body can produce the glucose that you need. What that means is the body has a sufficiency level that it needs of proteins to operate. And again, your body actually synthesizes almost 400 grams of protein a day. You're not eating the 400 grams of protein a day, right? But you're going to eat until you need to hit that sufficiency level. So what does that extrapolate to? If you're eating, let's say 50 grams of protein a day, which is low, and it is way lower than what I would recommend, if you're eating 50 grams of total protein a day, and we know in the research and the literature, it's got to be at least 100 to 120 grams, particularly as we get older. What it means is this theory assumes that if we're eating a relatively low protein diet, we will keep eating food in general till we get to that protein goal.
Still having a period, but you're feeling out of whack and you suspect your hormones might be playing tricks on you? It's time to get the lowdown on estrogen dominance with my free ebook. It is the no-nonsense guide to understanding estrogen dominance, how it contributes to pesky weight gain, abnormal, heavy, or painful periods, fibroids, and more. Say goodbye to the guesswork and hello to clarity. Dash on over to ed.hormoneshelp.com, grab your free copy, and get started on your journey to better health. Your body will thank you.
Nothing is more frustrating than being stuck on a fat loss plateau. So today on Menopause Mastery, we're going to talk about the specific strategies for women that are in perimenopause or menopause and even beyond to get off of a plateau, a body fat plateau. And we know fat loss can be particularly challenging for those of us in this transitional period and beyond. And it's really down to 3 factors. And we're going to talk about these 3 factors today and exactly what you need to do. The factors are visceral fat gain, anabolic resistance, and a thing called the protein leverage effect. So, like I said, many women experience difficulty losing weight during menopause. And for me, that actually started in my late 30s, early 40s. So there's a lot that happens with our menopausal transition from perimenopause to menopause, and particularly with the metabolic activities, despite having a healthy diet and exercise routine. So many of my clients over the last 20 years, and women that have been in my programs, and women that have communicated with me on the podcast said, you know what, Betty, I was doing the exact same thing I was doing before, and lo and behold, it's like my butt creeped up to the front of my abdomen, and all of a sudden, everything that I did before was no longer working. And especially that if they had any other setbacks, everything sort of accelerated. And if they lost a little bit of weight, they gained the weight back, only to have a harder time getting it off and getting stuck on plateaus. And there are a bunch of hormonal changes, and I talked about them before on the podcast that lead to this, but we're going to go into them today specifically around these key points, and I'm going to give you the exact steps, exactly what you need to do. So the reason why I thought about having this conversation, and I've talked around these subjects before on the podcast, it really came down to a conversation I had with a woman, I'll call her Sarah, earlier this week, and she was so very frustrated because she had been in that same place, right? Sarah had, been able to, I wouldn't say always maintain a healthy weight, but like after her pregnancies, she had a period where it took a little bit to get the weight off, but she could, in her words, and I air quote this, diet and, do some more exercise, get out there and work a little bit harder, and she could work off what she put on. And as she started heading into her late 40s, it felt like everything sort of came apart. And for her, she had a couple health problems that sort of set her back a little bit. She actually had some gut problems and some other things, and that just seemed to exacerbate the problem. And it really started me thinking that, a lot of people may not understand how this combination of 3 factors really set in for women and how we might be going about the process of repairing it incorrectly. So the first thing you need to know is your hormonal changes that are happening right now, even if you have adrenal problems, even if you have thyroid problems, are going to increase some very important things. They're going to increase visceral fat, and I'll explain that, muscle loss, and they're going to increase anabolic resistance. And this is why traditional weight loss methods, particularly things like calories in, calories out, and caloric expenditure through exercise alone, may not be working. And I'll explain exactly why, but we're going to go through those 3 points. So let's start with visceral fat. So what is visceral fat? So visceral fat is the fat that shows up and starts to accumulate underneath the muscle in and around your organs in your abdominal cavity. And it's more metabolically active than subcutaneous fat. So what that means is it actually produces a bunch more inflammatory cytokines. So it in itself is inflammatory, and the things it produces are inflammatory. It makes us more insulin resistant. It has a higher risk for type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease, and basically all forms of disease. So why is this important? During the menopause transition, changes, particularly in estrogen, as it declines, has been shown to cause an increase in visceral fat gain. So, what does that mean? It means your abdominal cavity is going to fill up with more fat, so our waistline is going to get wider, and so your waist to hip ratio, or your hourglass shape, is going to start to change, and you're going to gain weight around the middle. And it is because that loss of estrogen leads to a bunch of changes that increase that visceral fat. The other thing that happens is, oddly enough, as estrogen declines, our overall relative increase in our androgens, like testosterone and androstenedione and its other metabolites, relative to estrogen, increase that central fat accumulation. So women often get, not always, but what we would call gonadal body shape. The gonadal or ovarian body shape is your more curvy body shape, right? Weight gain around the hips and thighs, maybe around the breasts and upper arms, but a smaller waistline. The apple body style that is associated more with androgens, where we pick up weight around the middle and not on the legs, hips, and thighs, is more associated with androgens and more likely to happen on men, but women and men will both do some level of this. But women, like I said, like Susan's comment to me, she said, Betty, I feel like I got a front butt. It's like all of a sudden where I started gaining weight was all on the front. And it's not so much just the fat that's subcutaneous, right? The fat that's on top of the muscle. It's what's also happening is we're gaining it around the middle underneath the muscle. So the overall circumference is getting larger. So the estrogen decline and the relative increase of androgen relative to estrogen drives that. Here's what the studies say. So when your trainer says that there is no reason why you are having a hard time losing visceral fat, what the studies show is that this happens absolutely because of estrogen, and that caloric restriction and exercise efforts do not cause the visceral fat on women to come off through just exercise and caloric deprivation. So the traditional means to get this burned off by just exercising more, cutting back on your macros and your calories, controlling for calories, does not work in the same way. Not to say that maybe you couldn't starve yourself and make that weight come off, but it doesn't come off in the way that it's supposed to be effective. So, insulin resistance is also associated with menopause, right? We have at first in our 40s a higher level of estrogen relative to progesterone, so we get more insulin resistance because they feed off each other. But when we lose estrogen completely, we also see a greater level of insulin resistance. And insulin is the hormone that helps us take sugar out of the blood and take it to the muscle to burn. So if I add that to that visceral fat gain, what do you think happens? Now I've got more insulin resistance. Now I've got more inflammatory fat. My fat's making more inflammatory cytokines, which therefore makes me more insulin resistant. And that also contributes to that central fat weight gain as well. We also see a decrease in metabolic rate. So women experience a decrease in metabolic rate. Aging process, loss of those hormones can slow the metabolism. Not necessarily all the time, but if you're not doing the right activities and the right eating plan to eat for your hormones, you can see a decrease in metabolic rate. So what that means is your resting metabolic rate, the calories you burn under a relaxed state, starts to decline, right? So your ability to burn your fuels becomes less efficient, so you need less food to accomplish the same energy output. And when we get into what's happening next, you'll understand why. So that leads to greater weight gain, especially around the middle. And if we add more physical inactivity, right? If we are not getting enough movement, physical exercise, weight training, those kind of things, we're going to see an increase in visceral fat gain. Now, what's interesting about this is even short periods of time where you might be inactive can, during this transitional period, be impactful. So it's not that even short periods of time, let's say 6 months, 12 weeks, 3 months, those time periods, if you are highly inactive, you could easily see shifts in your metabolic activity and an increase in visceral fat weight gain around the middle, and then it becomes somewhat of a vicious cycle. So, what's the next one? So the next one is a thing called anabolic resistance. Anabolic resistance refers to the reduced ability for the body, particularly your muscles, to synthesize, which is making protein in response to food intake or resistance training and exercise. So your body is going to take the proteins that you eat, and it's also going to recycle proteins from itself. So the body actually uses, I think the stats are somewhere around 400 grams of protein a day. So it actually manufactures proteins off of its own parts. And some of that is because we have autophagy, which is the breaking down of cells, and the pieces inside the cells that your body's using is, think of it as kind of overhauling the cells and getting rid of the things that it doesn't need. Or mitophagy, which is again breaking down parts of your mitochondria, which is your powerhouse, to make it more resilient and more effective. But those are proteins that your body can then recycle and reuse. And it's going to use your proteins that you take in. So you eat proteins, they get broken down into the building blocks of amino acids, and those amino acids need to be synthesized, right? So taken and made into muscle tissue. When we become anabolic resistant, that starts to slow that process. It's associated with aging. So just the aging population, so getting older, means that we are more likely to do this. Now, as a scientist, I look at that and I say, is that because as an aging population, we tend to become less active, right? Could it be? But that's at least what the research shows. So it could be associated with aging, but it's definitely associated to lack of physical activity, chronic illness, or if there's other metabolic conditions like type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, other things that may cause a change in the other hormones, and particularly the glucose management of the body, then it's going to make it worse. Now, in menopausal women, we see an increase in anabolic resistance, making it harder for us to maintain, build, and synthesize muscle mass, right? What does that mean? It's harder for us to maintain the muscle that we have. So we see a loss of lean muscle in women as they go through menopause, and it accelerates as we age, unless we do things to reverse that. We see that it's harder to build muscle mass because we are working against a hormonal situation where the body is not as efficient. So we have to work harder if we want to put on muscle. And we aren't as efficient as taking our proteins that we take in dietarily and making them into muscle. So again, what causes this, right? So some of it is caused by a thing called sarcopenia, right? So that's the loss of muscle mass. Muscles start to lose the capacity to be sensitive to protein and sensitive to the actions of exercise, so they start to shrink, right? Physical inactivity, again, if we are physically inactive, even for a relatively short period of time, we might see significant muscle mass loss, but you wouldn't be able to see that by looking at what's happening on your scale, and you wouldn't probably see that by what's happening in your clothing. Right? So you could lose muscle mass and not have an obvious physical sign if you don't know how to track it. And we're going to talk about how to do that. So where I saw this really play out was during COVID, when we were locked down and gyms were closed, a lot of people, kind of fell into the COVID sort of, doom eating and relaxing on the couch. So a lot of people gained weight, but they also couldn't have as much activity because we closed down so many social things that allowed us to exercise where there was group exposure. That bit of inactivity led to a lot of people probably losing muscle mass and not even knowing that they were doing that. And then if you have an injury or something like that that sets you back, you're going to lose muscle mass. There was a study that looked at knee replacement and where people might have been somewhat immobilized or relatively inactive for, 7 days after surgery. And I believe, if I remember correctly, the amount of muscle mass loss was up to 2.3 kilograms, right? That's many pounds, right? So it doesn't take much for you to lose muscle mass. Now, chronic inflammation. So inflammatory cytokines, right? Those little inflammatory messengers that circulate around and cause general inflammation, your body fat is the one that makes it, right? Especially visceral fat. It's not the only place, but it's a significant portion of our inflammatory activity. And it interferes with actual muscle protein synthesis. So again, your body's ability to take protein where it needs to go and build muscle. And insulin resistance. So the muscles, particularly your muscles that move you, your skeletal muscles, they are insulin resistant, right? This impairs the anabolic effect of insulin on muscles. Insulin is part of the protein synthesis pathway, which when we get to the answers of how to overcome this is part of the picture to fix it. So insulin resistance is going to make your body less capable of using glucose, your sugar, at the muscles. And that's your biggest disposal area for your calories every day, your glucose, your body fat. It's in the muscles. And so we have to, I agree with Gabrielle Lyon, that muscle and holding on to muscle is one of the most vital things that we have to do. It is one of the main metabolic engines of our body's efficiency for glucose disposal and therefore reducing the risk for metabolic disease and diabetes, which right now statistically it looks like 1 in 3 Americans in, the Gen X population and the children behind us are going to be diabetic somewhere in their lifetime unless we turn the tides. Now, nutrient deficiencies also can cause problems with muscle protein synthesis and anabolic resistance, particularly essential nutrients like protein intake. So I hear it all the time from women. They're like, oh, I don't really like protein. I don't want to eat animal protein. You can do a vegetarian diet, but man, do you spend a lot of time in the kitchen in order to do that. And your complete proteins, your animal proteins are a easier source to reach your protein goals. But you could absolutely do it with a vegetarian diet, but you're going to have to be much more focused to make sure you get your protein intake. But other nutrients can also increase this issue, essential nutrients that could be reduced. What are some of the signs, right? So how would you know if you've got anabolic resistance? So reduce muscle mass. Right? You can't tell this by getting on the scale because very well you could have basically lost some muscle and gained body fat roughly at the same level, and your scale may not have moved very much, but your clothes fit very differently. Or you may have lost a couple pounds of muscle on your legs, but you don't really know that because nothing fits differently. But we can see it on either a DEXA scan that does body composition, or like we use the InBody in our office because it doesn't provide a radiation or any kind of X-ray technology, so we can use it repeatedly, and it can show us how much muscle mass you have. So one of the proxies for fitness level is grip strength. So I had somebody tell me, they're like, Betty, I'm working on my grip strength. I'm like, no. Grip strength is important because it's indicative of the strength of the human, right? If I can pick up something heavy and lift it and move it from here to here, that means that I'm strong. Chances are my grip strength is going to be strong in order for me to pick up something heavy to move it. So it's a easy indicator, but the grip itself is not what's important. It's the overall muscle mass. But if you notice that your muscle strength is decreasing, that could be a sign. Poor recovery from exercise. So if you feel like you're drained after exercise and you don't feel good, you take several days to overcome exercise, that may be a sign. It could be a sign of other things, but this could be one of them. If you feel like you also have a difficulty in gaining muscle mass, and elevated inflammatory markers. And we're going to talk specifically about those. So elevated inflammatory markers can tell us, A, probably do I have visceral fat that's overproducing stuff, inflammatory cytokines, and B, am I also appearing to be anabolic resistant? Now, there's also the protein leverage effect. So the protein leverage effect, this is a hypothesis. I wouldn't say it's 100% true, but it is a very interesting hypothesis to play out. So statistically, in the research, if you look at the studies that looked at case-controlled, even crossover human clinical trials, when you control for caloric intake, the diets between a low-fat, low-carb, low-protein diet all pretty much compete similarly. Now, there's a few interesting things. They don't always have a diverse group of people. They don't have diverse ages. They also may lack generalizability because they probably have a predominantly white population, which doesn't extrapolate to other ethnic backgrounds. There's a lot of things that could be wrong with those studies. And again, many of the studies are performed on young men in college, which are very different than a 45 to 55 or 60-year-old female. Now, this came out of these studies. So what makes the difference between a high-fat, high-carb, and high-protein diet may or may not, when we look at epidemiological studies or very large population studies, there may not be a huge difference between their effect in the short term, right? In the short term, if you calorically restrict somebody, they're going to lose weight for a period of time. But the problem is the high carb, low protein diet doesn't work very long, and it doesn't seem to be very sustainable. A low fat diet, right? If it's a high protein diet, does, right? A low carb or relatively low carb with a higher protein intake seems to outperform. And this is where the protein leverage effect came from. So what it suggests is that humans will continue to eat until they meet their protein needs, regardless of caloric content. So protein is a required nutrient. It is essential. So are fats, right? You have to consume fat. You have to consume protein. You can completely go 100% without carbs, and our body can produce the glucose that you need. So what that means is the body has a sufficiency level that it needs of proteins to operate. And again, your body actually synthesizes almost 400 grams of protein a day. You're not eating the 400 grams of protein a day, right? But you're going to eat until you need to hit that sufficiency level. So what does that extrapolate to? If you're eating, let's say 50 grams of protein a day, which is low, incredibly low. That's way lower than the RDA, which is too low. And it is way lower than what I would recommend if you're eating 50 grams of total protein a day. And we know in the research and the literature, it's got to be at least 100 to 120 grams, particularly as we get older. What it means is this theory assumes that if we're eating a relatively low protein diet, we will keep eating food in general till we get to that protein goal. So you might be surprised, but the average person eats a lot more carbohydrate than they do protein. And so if I'm not meeting that sufficiency protein amount, I'll just eat, because there's a little bit of protein in everything, right? Even grains have protein. Everything has a little bit of protein in it. But I'll be driven to eat more until I hit that protein sufficiency effect, right? So lower protein generally in studies show that it leads to higher caloric consumption. So we eat more in general. High protein, right? So eating a higher protein diet leads to lower overall caloric intake, and that's pretty standard in the literature. It seems to also have an effect on hunger and satiety. Persistent hunger happens to be one of the major drawbacks to a low protein diet. That's why a high carb diet, low protein and low fat seems to be less effective and really was a dismal failure back in the 90s, if you remember that, because we get increased satiety from a higher protein diet. And if you look at body weight and body composition studies that actually looked at the fat to muscle ratio, there's weight gain on low protein diets, and there's better weight management, particularly longer term studies, not just a couple weeks, but when we're looking further and further out with a higher protein diet. So if you're in this place, you're like, I am so stuck on this plateau. It may be because you have an increase in visceral fat gain that is inflammatory, and it's because your hormones are shifting. It may also be that you have some anabolic resistance and your body isn't as efficient at taking the proteins that you eat and making muscle out of it. And it is also resistant at the muscle to utilize your blood sugar and fuel like fat properly. So your body stores fat instead of using it to actually burn. And in that process, our body will actually make sugar in the liver rather than using your body fat as fuel. And at the very last bit, we could also have this protein leverage effect that might very well be affecting how your body is sending signals from the brain for you to eat. Because again, I get a lot of women, they're like, Betty, I only want to eat protein maybe 3 times a week. And I'm like, okay, are you eating enough beans? Are we eating a protein shake that might be vegetarian so we can get additional protein calories? And they're like, I don't really want that. And I'm like, okay, well, if we were to really look at your protein intake for a week, just calculate it out and look at it, it may be hard for you to eat adequately or to reduce the carbohydrate content because your body is still telling you to eat because it needs more protein. All right, so here's the issues. It's visceral fat gain, right, around the belly, underneath the muscle, anabolic resistance, muscles in the body aren't using fuel properly and can't use your protein properly, and we're not building muscle, and we have a protein leverage effect. Our body will continue to try and tell you to consume more foods until it hits a protein level. So how do we figure this out, right? So number one, chances are who you're seeing, whoever your practitioner is probably not doing body composition. To me, I don't care about the number on the scale. I know we fixate on that number. I know we look at that number all the time and we're really concerned with, I want to get back to this whatever number. What I care about is what is the body composition? What is the body fat to muscle ratio? How is that playing out? Because that by far is more important to me. I'd rather have you hold muscle mass and maybe have more subcutaneous fat than what you want than for you to lose muscle mass to only be, pardon me, a sarcopenic person where I've got maybe a thinner body type, but I am under muscled. That is by far a greater risk for your longevity and health span. Way, way greater risk. Right? So you need to work with somebody that knows how to assess that and also knows what's really going on, right? Because if they just tell you eat less and work out more, that's not effective. We've already heard that kind of contrite, stupid answer, and it doesn't work. And you have to understand where your hormones are playing a role in this. Not only your sex hormones like estrogen and your androgens and progesterone, but your insulin and your cortisol and your thyroid. All of those are important to this picture. And so if you don't have somebody like that, you need to probably, start looking for somebody that can help you because you're going to be dealing with an uphill battle. Also, if you have a trainer, I've worked with many trainers. I worked with a single trainer for over 7 years when I was really immersed in the bodybuilding world. And he was great at helping me, put on muscle and get off body fat, because I wanted to compete or whatever it was I was doing. But the reality is it wasn't a sustainable dietary pattern that a regular everyday person could do. It took a lot of mental energy to me, having to worry about what I was going to eat 6 times a day, every 2 to 3 hours, having protein shakes twice a day, every day. To me, it was an unsustainable model because I had other things I wanted to put my intellectual thoughts and property on. Some people love that, right? That's not what I want to spend, 6 hours a day working on. I'd rather do other things. You may be working with a trainer who may be well-intentioned and maybe they're very good at working with people that are in a different metabolic state. But if you're frustrated with that, it may be because they don't understand these very basic mechanisms that lead to the plateau that we experience. Now, so we've got the medical concern. And then you know me. If they haven't checked your hormones and you don't know what's going on with those, I think it's really important to really know what your body's doing. You shouldn't fall for that message that we don't need to look because your hormones are too varied. Or it couldn't be that because you're not in menopause yet, or whatever story you get. The next thing is we need to balance the nutrition, right? We need to eat a diet rich in proteins, and I'm going to give you the exact kind of numbers that we're shooting for. And we need to incorporate the right kind of exercise to get off the plateau to change those anabolic resistance and the protein leverage effect. And we have to make lifestyle adjustments, particularly around stress and sleep, to help that. All right, so let's get into the most important part. So one of the most challenging things is, and I struggle with this even when I'm talking to my menopause metabolism mastery group, is people will always tell me, Betty, I want to lose weight or lose body fat, but then they'll say within the same breath, often, not always, but often they'll say, I want to gain muscle. I'm like, those are not two completely diametrically opposed things, but the mechanism in which to address them are different, right? And let me explain why. So in the bodybuilding world, bodybuilders are really good at manipulating their body composition, right? And again, I was very into that for a very long time. I still lift heavy. I still do stuff like that, but I'm just not spending, my social hours with bodybuilders at the moment. So one of the things that is very true in bodybuilding is you are in a growth phase or a cutting phase. Right? Growth phase is where you are eating more and you're eating more protein, you're eating more carbohydrates, you're feeding that insulin and protein synthesis pathway to try and drive muscle growth. And when you do that, you will put on muscle and size. Now, women can't put on size. Unless you're doing a bunch of anabolic steroids, it's real hard to put on true size. But in the bodybuilding world, you might work really hard for 6 months to put on 5 pounds of muscle, right? And you might eat 2,500, 3,000 calories to do that a day, which scares women to death, right? Because they're like, oh my gosh, I can't imagine that, right? But you're going to put on muscle because for every pound of muscle you put on, it burns an extra 150 calories a day. And the exercise effect that you're using to do that, because eating, of course, you can eat and just eat 3,000 calories a day and gain body fat. But to put on muscle, we have to exercise in a way that drives this very strong metabolic engine to build muscle, which means we have to do heavy weight training and lots of it, right? So at this time in the bodybuilding world, we do big body group. A lot of people do splits, like they might do legs one day, they might do chest and back another day, they might do arms and abs the next day, and then low intensity cardio, and then start back over, right? But you're doing a lot of weight training, and it's very specific to get volume. And then they will also throw in a strength and conditioning day where the repetitions are low and the sets are low, but the weight is high, right? Because what those two exercise volumes do is they give two different messages to the muscle. So if I am trying to really put on muscle, reverse anabolic resistance, and make my body efficient at making muscle, I want to do low repetition, low volume, high weight, because what that does is stimulate muscle fiber growth, right? It heavily stimulates, make the muscle bigger. If I do high repetition, high volume, lower weight, it's going to stimulate a little bit. It's going to stimulate that, but not quite as great. But it is going to stimulate that, and it'll also stimulate mitochondrial biogenesis, which makes your muscles more efficient, right? Both will lead to reversing anabolic resistance. Both do, right? But the focus is on building, right? So the challenge is if you get right here and you strip out the carbohydrate content and you try and calorically restrict, you're almost giving the body two different messages. You're telling it, hey, I'm doing a lot of volume of weight training, but I'm also going to not give you the fuel to help your body overcome that anabolic resistance, reduce the inflammatory effect. And you could really, honestly, be backfiring what you're doing, right? So if you're trying to get off this plateau, you want to up your exercise volume, but don't reduce caloric intake. Right? Up the volume of the resistance training that you're doing and reduce cardio, because cardio is going to strip off muscle, but it raises your stress chemistry, it raises cytokines, and it may be driving that inflammatory visceral fat to make more messengers to say, hey, I'm inflamed, and reverse the whole process. You can do low intensity zone 2, right? Low intensity, that's just telling your body, hey, biogenesis of mitochondria, let's build some mitochondria, let's become more efficient, but don't work too hard. And this may also be a time that if you're doing high intensity interval, you want to do really short durations, right? 15-minute, once or twice a week. Don't rock it out here for months on end and every day a week. So the first thing is to think about adding physical volume to your exercise, because again, that's going to drive the muscle protein synthesis and start to reverse the anabolic resistance. Then with food, if your goal is to really build muscle, and I honestly will tell you, you want to get stronger and more muscular, I would still eat carbohydrates at meals. I would still eat protein, but what the protein goal should be, especially if I'm trying to build, is about 1.2 to 2 grams per kilogram of body weight a day, right? Obviously, the higher you go up towards that 2 grams per kilogram, the more you're going to get that protein synthesis message. In somebody who's metabolically fit, right, and somebody whose body is really efficient, just eating more protein would increase muscle protein synthesis. When we've been overweight, when we're menopausal, when we may have been injured or we've been inactive, we may not be as efficient at that as we used to, right? So you'll fall somewhere into that continuum. That's why we work with our people and we figure out where they are in that continuum. But you want to make sure you get ideal protein in order for your body to build the muscle it needs to build. You need a little bit of carbohydrates. Now, my preference is whole food-based carbohydrates like, starchy vegetables, legumes. If people do grains, whole grains, non-GMO, lots and lots of vegetables, a little bit of fruit once or twice a day. Use those foods because it's going to help you push that protein into the muscle and actually utilize glucose in that process. And we want to focus on making sure we get protein, particularly protein in the morning meal and whatever we close the day. So whatever you break your fast and whatever you close the day. That study came out 2 years ago looking at if we had a larger bolus or a larger chunk of protein at that first meal and the last meal, we were more efficient as an older person at making muscle than if we drizzled it out in little 10, 20 gram doses throughout the day. Pretty interesting, huh? So you can do that to make more muscle protein, right? And make it synthesize more muscle. Then do that for several weeks. Don't worry about where the scale is going. Don't worry about whether it's going up or down. Just focus on that. Because what's going to happen is you're going to start building muscle. And as you build more muscle, you're going to become a better metabolic engine. And then you can start looking at, how is your body doing? Because often what happens is that muscle starts to replace the fat, even though the scale may not be moving that much, but 5 pounds of muscle takes up a lot less space than 5 pounds of fat. So your body composition is going to start to change. And where we see it the most is that waistline because you're losing visceral fat. Then if you want to start cutting, then we can play with distributing your macros, which are going to be your carbohydrates, your fats, and proteins, differently to help cut some of the additional fat. But think about it as I need to build a little bit first, then I need to cut the body fat, which I know is a mind game because all of us want to just see the scale move down. But I promise you it works better. Now, next thing, stress management. We got to do some mindfulness and chill out and relax. I'm not going to beat this horse to death today, but we got to make sure that you're sleeping because that's the most important thing to muscle recovery. And, looking at relaxation activities, grounding, spending time in nature, early morning sunlight exposure, all of those de-stressing activities can absolutely help you become less inflamed, become a healthier metabolic engine. And you want to incorporate from these lifestyle and diet things, just think of an anti-inflammatory lifestyle. Lots of fruits and vegetables, olive oil, avocado oil, nuts and seeds, whole grains. If you eat them, cool. If you don't, that's cool too. Lean meats, clean meats, not a lot of processed foods. Recommended to kind of just pull those out completely. Focus on quality over quantity. And then if you think about the activities of what you'd want to know. So how do we know if this is going on? So there's a couple measurements you can take. There's several things that we can look at. So first off, body composition. So we use a bioimpedance device that allows us to look at this information. But you can also find DEXA scans that do body composition. Often you can get them for about $100, $150. I wouldn't say do that often because you are exposing yourself to X-ray, but it can tell you where the fat is distributed. Your waist circumference. So an increased waist circumference, so that's the natural waist, which is about 2 inches underneath the rib, about where your belly button lies, where we can tell what's going on with the visceral fat. So I know men often might wear their belt really low and let their kind of belly hang over it. What we want is basically right across at the belly button or slightly above. Now, if it's greater than 35 inches for women that's a sign that there's quite a bit of visceral fat. Even if there's a lot of subcutaneous fat, which is the jiggly fat that's on the outside that we don't like, if it's over 35, we're going to say that there's quite a bit of visceral fat. And actually, we want that to be under 30, ideally, right? Your waist circumference. When we look at the waist to hip ratio, we want that under 0.85, so the waist relative to the hip circumference. So you could get just a cheap tape measure and look at that, right? So essentially that hourglass shape, because if we don't have that hourglass shape and we've got a wider waistline, that's a sign of the apple body shape, and that may be a sign, particularly if you've got a protruding belly, for increased visceral fat. If we want to look at things like insulin resistance and anabolic resistance, we can do tests like your fasting insulin and fasting glucose levels, your hemoglobin A1C. We can also do a calculated what they call HOMA-IR, which is an insulin resistance score, especially if we have measurements to tell us what your body composition really looks like. We can also do a glucose insulin tolerance test and look at what your insulin response is after eating, because often glucose doesn't rise radically, but we see a pretty significant jump in insulin. And then if you have elevated cholesterol, triglycerides, and reduced levels of HDL, that is a pretty big signal that there's probably some visceral fat activities. And then inflammatory markers like highly sensitive C-reactive protein and some of your other cardiovascular markers can also be an indicator of some of these things happening, right? So let's just wrap this up so you know exactly what you need to do, right? So if you're struggling and you're on the plateau, my recommendation is, hey, let's, instead of focusing on trying to get that scale to move one more time, for the next several weeks, focus on building more muscle. Focus on building more muscle and getting stronger. Because what will happen is you will, and your body will become more metabolically fit. And then we can worry about cutting, because chances are you're going to have composition changes. You're going to look different, and your body is going to look different because there is a change between the muscle mass and the body fat if you focus on getting stronger. Here's what you want to think about next, right? So go back and listen to the key points. Advocate for yourself during medical appointments. Advocate to get a reliable, helpful practitioner that can help you. Embrace these ideas of not so much just trying to reduce body fat by restriction, but by using your chemistry as a way to really retool your metabolism. And when you give your body the right support, when you give your body what it needs, your body actually will correct what you don't want anymore. A lot of times we focus on the weight being the problem, right? The medical community says that. We hear it everywhere on social media that the body fat is the problem. Your weight is your problem. Your weight is indicative of a problem. It is a symptom of the problem. It is not the problem. It is not the problem. It is your body thinking it's saving you. It thinks it's doing the right thing because it's getting the wrong messages. Much of that is hormonal, but it can be inflammatory. It can be muscle mass changes. It can be a lot of other things. And what we went over today is exactly how you can tool and retool what you're doing to get off that plateau, to get it moving in the right direction, and to also help regulate your metabolic activities and make your body more efficient. So if you loved this episode, what I would love for you to do today is, if you haven't subscribed, hit the subscribe button. That helps us in ways you can't even imagine. It helps us get better guests when I have guests, and it's just super important. So hit the subscribe, and I'll see you next week.
Thank you so much for tuning in to the Menopause Mastery Podcast. You are why I'm here, and I am so very grateful. Hit subscribe so you don't miss any wisdom on creating the most exceptional life on our terms. If this episode has helped you in any way, please share it with a friend to spread the love, and together we rise. You can follow me on social media at Betty Murray, PhD, and you can reach me online at bettymurray.com.